Hello there and welcome to this very exciting course overview video for cinematic lighting in Houdini. My name is Nick Chamberlain and we are going to dive in and explain a little bit of what this course is about. What does it mean to light in 3D? What does it mean to use Solaris? So we will dive into everything you can expect to learn in this course and see what it all includes. So at the outset of making this, I had three main goals. I wanted to first teach how to approach lighting a 3D scene from both a creative and cinematic perspective. I wanted to compare it to the filmmaking process. How do we tell a story with our lighting? How do we show emotion? How do we use our lighting to create separation and draw attention to the right areas of frame? And also, how do we create an aesthetically pleasing image? We're going to compare our CG tools to the tools that we have on set when you are filming in real life. And we're going to dive into a lot of different examples and break down, really what is the cinematic look. I feel like it's said all the time, but we're really going to dive in, and I have a bunch of examples lined up that we'll be running throughout this course as we kind of break down what it means to light emotionally and story-based and really start to develop our eye and ask the questions we need to be thinking about and answering when we are lighting. And then in addition to, understanding lighting from a creative standpoint and its overall story purpose, I also wanted to talk about the technical process of lighting within a photorealistic VFX pipeline. How do we mimic these tools that we have on-set lighting? How do we use photography that we get from on-set? When can we cheat the lighting versus when can we really just be a little restricted by the original plate based on how much we are replacing? What is a good VFX lighting cheat versus a bad one? And really, how do we process a visual effects shot from plate ingest all the way to our 3D software back to compositing? What does that look like? How do we manage our color space? How do we account for lens distortion? How do we make sure that everything is looking the same from program to program? Because I think that's something that is very, very important as we're working to make sure we have a sound technical workflow. And, we'll also dive into what happens when we don't have any information from set. What if they didn't take an HDR? What if they don't even know what lens it was shot on? Because more often than not, that is what you are going to get in a real VFX job. As much as we wish they took HDRs that were perfect, we have LiDAR scans of every location, that doesn't happen too often. And so you kind of have to deal with what you are given. So we'll dive into what happens when you don't have HDRs. And when you do have HDRs, a lot of the time you can't just slap an HDR in there. If you've ever tried to do that and hope it all ended up looking correct, you'll know the struggle and how hard that can really be. We're going to talk about spatial lighting and how to do match grades with our HDR and our plate. So we'll dive into that and really understand the technical process of lighting within a photoreal VFX pipeline. And then my final main goal was to explain USD and how to apply the knowledge of USD practically. I am a big believer that USD is the future of 3D pipelines. USD has so many different advantages. It is incredibly collaborative, it's very efficient, and it is so much more than just a simple file format. It is more than just a universal Alembic or FBX or what have you. It really has its own set of rules, and it is in itself a pipeline. I once heard a comparison that I think just really hits the nail right on the head. If you think of the EXR file format for compositing, it's really the standard for handing off images between different departments with high quality and minimal data loss. Any artist who doesn't understand the use or function of EXRs in a 2D pipeline really is at a disadvantage because it has so much to offer. And I think USD promises to be that EXR for 3D. I think it is going to really be the new standard. And I think that's a very exciting future because if you've ever had to hand off assets or try to collaborate without a pipeline, you'll know how difficult it could be. If you've ever used Maya referencing, I think that is a good way to kind of push assets without needing a huge pipeline across a huge series of shots. But USD takes all of those advantages you see with Maya referencing and just expands them. You have all the scene data available. You can tweak it on a per shot basis if you want without needing to go back into any other files. There's a lot of advantages to USD. I think the unfortunate part, as I was learning USD myself, it's kind of hard to learn USD at the outset because from the outside it feels much more complex and technical than your standard 3D workflow. And I do think this is true to some degree. USD does have its own complexities and eccentricities. I think the hardest part of learning USD is that many of the resources that are out there are incredibly technical and don't necessarily bake USD concepts down to their practical application. How can I use this USD idea or concept to make my shot look better and to do it quicker? You shouldn't have to be a pipeline developer in order to know how to use USD. And so my approach to visual effects has always been on the practicality of tools. And so I want to explain USD throughout this class in a way that is very clear and practically applicable. And I'm going to try to use minimal technical jargon. That's not to say we're not going to talk about the techie lingo that USD uses. We'll be breaking that down into its simplest form so that you can have a practical knowledge of how to use it. Now you'll notice in these three main goals, I haven't said the word Solaris once. And to me, that is, to some degree, intentional. Solaris is a tool to apply these three main goals that I listed. We can use Solaris to light a 3D scene in cinematic ways. We can use Solaris and Nuke to technically create a good lighting workflow with color consistency throughout. We can use Solaris to author and implement USD. But Solaris is ultimately just a tool, and the principles that we're teaching here, I hope, go much further than just Solaris. I hope if you're lighting in any package, they will be applicable and you have something to think about as USD continues to take over. If you're just interested in understanding how USD works, I hope that this scratches that itch for you, because I think I said it earlier, but at the end of the day, they're just tools, and we need to understand why we're using them, why we're pressing the buttons that we're pressing, and that is going to get us so much further than learning exactly what Solaris's implementation of USD does. We need to understand what USD is so we can know how to interact with it through Solaris. And that's not to say we won't be learning Solaris. We absolutely will. Solaris has a ton of fun tools to use that will help us with lighting, layout, and our scene assembly. But ultimately, we are just executing our three main goals through Solaris, and we will be learning all of them together. We will also be doing a little bit of Nuke for plate prep and some look dev on the back end. Once we do our renders, we'll talk about AOVs. We'll dive into that a little bit. There's not going to be anything revolutionary in the compositing sections. We're just going to kind of run through a quick overview of how I like to make things look a little bit more realistic, but we're not going to dive deep into keying or anything like that. No crazy multi-pass compositing happening here, just kind of your basic standard stuff. And so when we're talking about this course, I tried to make it in a way that, it was the lighting class I wanted when I was first starting out and first learning. And so what we've done here, I've kind of taken some of my pain points and hopefully made them less painful for you. We are including assets with this course. Let's take a look at them really quick. So we have a couple lined up for us here. So this is coming included, fully textured. We have this little bomber asset loaded up in here. It's really cool. It's really fun to light. It has a lot of kind of interesting angles to bounce light off of. We can maybe just change this to like a sunnier environment and see what that looks like. And it's a really, really nice, smaller asset for us to kind of get our feet wet as we are starting to learn to light scenes. Because like I said, Solaris is really about scene assembly, lighting, and rendering. We are not making hero assets in this class. That is another discipline entirely, and I'm certainly not the one to build a hero asset. I actually hired one of my really good friends who's been Emmy nominated, VES nominated for his work, and he's very, very talented, and he's made a good chunk of these assets. We're also including this giant cruiser. We'll let this load in for a second. This is a pretty big, pretty heavy asset, but I really, really like the way that it looks. I think it's really fun. You can see it takes a second to load up here because there is a lot of data in it, but it's a really nice hero quality asset. I think the design, you know, when we were making it, we were really aiming for something that was somewhere between Dune and Star Wars, and I think we hit that pretty nicely. Maybe we can go to the overcast view of it. But this is a really big ship. It's, I think, maybe like 20 million polygons. There's about 500 textures, so this will really put your computer through the paces. But these are the kind of assets you will have in production from one means to another as you're working. Things will start to get heavy, and we can kind of see how we can start to work with those, how we can optimize them in our viewport. But this will be included with the course. There is also a little structure that I did make. It's not the craziest asset in the world, but you know, it does work for our means. You know, I'm still changing that circle. I didn't really like the way that quite ended up, but we'll have this structure for us to play with as well. I really wanted to, you know, give you guys tools and assets that you could use to play around with this. You don't have to go to Kit Bash. You're more than welcome to if you'd like, but it's not entirely necessary if you want to take this course. And we're also including this unshaded pack of Kit Bash objects. All of these are included with the course. You get to use them as you are following along with the lessons. And one of the weeks is going through how to shade these procedurally for like midground, background use. Let me just show you really quick. I have something on my other screen, and we'll do some procedural shader setup here. You can kind of see me switching in the top net, and this is just all set up procedurally. Nothing here is stuck, and it looks pretty good in the distant background. And we will also be taking a look at, you know, adding variation for our individual buildings. This is all the exact same shader, and they're being instanced, and each instance point has a different attribute that is driving different parameters. Some of these have different accent colors, some of them have different lighting amounts. They're all varied from building to building. They're not perfectly uniform. And you know, this instancing example really is as uniform as it gets at the moment. They're all the exact same building, but the shader is different. That's really what I wanted to show you. So we will be including all of these with the course for you to use. We'll learn how we can build these procedural assets, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun in doing that. So yeah, we have a good collection of elements to use, and these are mostly what I used in the course trailer. You know, as we play here, we can see the bomber and the cruiser, and we'll be going through all of these shots through one means or the other. The one thing I did want to say is some of these like hero assets here, these are from a great big, medium, small pack, because like I said, hero assets, you're always going to need high quality assets, and I couldn't distribute these, unfortunately. So some of these immediate foreground pieces are from a big, medium, small kit. Some of these are from mega scans, but you don't need to have those to follow along with the course. But you know, if you want to add your own assets, it doesn't really hurt to have. We will look into creating this top-down Earth shot. This is a 3D Earth that I made. These were matte painted images on this front angle here and the side angle that I cannot redistribute, but we'll talk about where you can find planet assets to use as you're lighting and rendering your shot. Really, the planet, I think, is the least important thing in this. It's really about the general composition, the lighting, and knowing how to have that all set up to feel realistic. And so we have some excellent questions lined up that I want to go through. So is this more technical or theory or both? And like I said in our intro, I try to cover both. I think the theory is incredibly important. We're going to dive into that quite a bit. We're going to have kind of dives into the principles of cinematography and how we can apply them here in our CG land, but we'll also be talking about the technical. So the answer is both. We're definitely going to dive into the technical aspects of USD so that we can kind of understand it. What confusing terminology does USD have that overlaps with our current terminology in non-USD land? Because there's quite a bit of overlap, so we'll be aiming to clear as much of that up as possible and just really have a firm foundation of knowledge for how to use USD in Solaris. What is the strength of the USD workflow? I think there are a lot of advantages to USD. One of them is USD is very, very efficient. It talks directly to your renderers. It's also, the most collaborative format that there really is. We can send it from program to program. Almost all the major DCCs support USD in one way or another, and if they don't fully support it, they are working towards implementing it. And so that means we're maintaining instancing when we're going from program to program. We don't have to bake down large scatters and try to recreate them in other programs. But it not only works within, between programs, but it also works within itself. It allows multiple people to very easily work on the same sequence of shots. It allows you to make one small change to an asset and push that to, it could be hundreds of shots. Instead of having to go into project file after project file and update that, you're able to just automatically do that through USD. And I think that's very, very powerful. And I would also potentially argue that using Solaris is a benefit of the USD workflow itself. I know it's not directly related to USD, but the node-based workflow just makes so much more sense to me in terms of how to light a scene in multiple shots at the same time and being able to individually edit a piece of geometry, but just for one shot without, doing the normal object context, which is, very unclear what is being included. It can get very messy very quickly. There's lots of little layers you need to dive into, where with Solaris, it's node graphed, it's all exposed, and you're able to just modify it at once. And it's very clear visually through your scene graph and your scene tree where exactly things are being placed. And not to mention, it's fun layout and lighting tools. I really like the spec light placer, the diffuse light placer. There's a lot of fun tools in it that make me enjoy lighting more. So that's not exactly, a USD specific benefit, but it is a reason that I like Solaris, and you need to know USD to be able to use Solaris and take advantage of that benefit. Are we going to need Houdini 20? I would highly recommend it. I think that Solaris in the earlier versions was pretty buggy. It was pretty crashy, and it's starting to get very, very stable now. It's still a visual effects software. You're still going to have crashes, but the earlier you go with Solaris, I think the more unstable it tends to get. So I would personally use the latest version that you can. With each release, they fix a lot of bugs and sometimes introduce new ones, but typically they fix more than they create. So I would definitely recommend Houdini 20. How do I know if my Houdini knowledge is the right level for this course? That is a great question. So like I said earlier, my plan is to build us from the ground up in the stage context, and that's a brand new stage context, so we're going to be going over the bare basics. I expect you to be able to navigate in Houdini. You don't need to be a master at it, but you need to know how nodes work, that we can dive into nodes, that they need to be chained together in order to see what we're viewing. But we are going to start from the very base level and build up to a fairly sophisticated level of knowledge within Solaris and USD. So if you understand general 3D concepts, I think that is arguably more important than being able to navigate Houdini, because at the end of the day, these are just buttons. So we won't be going over, why normal maps are plugged in here, why roughness, what diffuse does. So that kind of 3D knowledge I expect you to have. We will talk about color space and implementing that, but that's sort of the level of 3D knowledge I expect someone who takes this course to have. And our next question, to what extent will the USD workflow be used and or explained? Is this course based on the USD workflow? Yes, it is. It is based on the USD workflow through Solaris, and we'll be taking a couple looks at it. The USD workflow is much more important when you're working collaboratively or across a large sequence of shots. One could argue it's potentially slightly less important when you're working on one-off shots by by yourself because there is less collaboration that is needed. So we'll take a look kind of at both perspectives as we're working. We'll build a shot and we'll say, well, this is how we did it by ourselves. Let's actually go through these same steps and see how we would do it if we were on a team of people. And we can kind of compare and contrast those two ways of working. So yes, we will be covering the USD workflow. We'll find that it applies more to teams and groups of people who are working together, but it is still related either way. So yes, definitely be covering it. How much time goes into Karma versus Arnold, and what are the differences in application scenarios between Arnold and Karma? So I like using Arnold basically when I have a render farm that can support it, when the render times aren't super slow. That's what I use professionally at work. And so for shots where my computer took maybe like 6 to 7 minutes a frame to render, I ended up using Arnold because I personally think Arnold can handle anything you throw at it, and it handles stuff really well, it scales well, but you do ultimately need a farm to be able to render out of Arnold anything that is highly complex. So the shots in the trailer that are more towards the beginning, where you see just a ship and the cruiser in the background, those I did in Arnold, and you're really able to do it in either render engine. The principles and theory are what matter rather than the render engine, because honestly most physically based renderers are pretty good these days. I would say that will probably be maybe like 65% Karma, just because I think it'll be more approachable and more people will be able to render quicker because of Karma XPU. But if you have any questions with trying to use your renderer of choice, Arnold versus Karma, we'll certainly go through. We'll try to answer them. We're actually going to set up some really nice, fun tools for Arnold as well. If you've ever tried to use Arnold in Solaris, you know that there are a few gotchas in terms of setting up AOVs. We're going to learn how to automatically set up our light groups within Solaris, which you can typically do in normal Houdini, but not Solaris. But we're actually going to build a small tool to do that. And we're going to build USD kind of with VEX-esque coding. So I'm really excited to show you that. But yeah, I think we'll probably try to lean a little bit more towards Karma, because people, I think, will be able to use that more. But, they're tools at the end of the day. They're both physically based renderers. And we're actually going to see from our scene setup just how similarly they behave when we're creating our shaders and kind of working within it. Can I follow along with Redshift? That is a great question. I have not used Redshift with Solaris personally, so I don't know its level of integration. I don't know if it is buggy, if it is working flawlessly. So I would say if you're following along with not Karma and not Arnold, you're more than welcome to. Like I said, the theory and principles will still apply, but if you start running into technical hurdles, I will be less able to help you because I'm not as in tune with those renderers, but I will still do my best to answer those questions. So I would say, yes, you can follow along with the asterisk. Tech help will probably be not as easy for me to give just because I'm not as familiar with that implementation within Solaris. Is most of the course using ready-made assets and concentrating on lighting setups? Is there much involving scene assembly, scattering, etc.? So yes, most of this course is using ready-made assets. We're going to look at how to assemble and process assets within Solaris, but it's definitely not a focus. I think it may be like a week and a half that we spend on that. We are definitely focusing on scene assembly, scattering, lighting setup when we start doing our big wide shot with the ocean. We're going to learn a lot about scattering in that week, as well as some following weeks once we get to live action footage. Is the course going to tackle massive environment management, ways to optimize and automate it? Yes, we will go over some of the ideas and concepts that go into making them more renderable, levels of detail. We're going to look at texture, quality, and where do we really need those 4K textures versus where can we optimize, where can we share textures when we have assets that come from a pack, and how do we ultimately get this thing rendered? Because rendering is a challenge in itself when you're working by yourself, so focusing on optimizing is really, really big for me, especially when it comes to our final output for compositing, because there's a couple things that really you need to focus on in Arnold especially to set up correctly so that your comps will load quickly when you load up your EXRs, because that can start to get kind of heavy. But we'll be going over really doing all of this as efficiently as possible, because doing things efficiently is ultimately going to let us do it faster and easier. And that is a big thing that I try to emphasize as I'm working. The next question is, additionally, I am curious about the workflow we'll be following throughout this course. Will we be aligning our approach with industry standards, specifically in how shots are planned, brought into Solaris, the process of setting up lighting? Absolutely. We're going to go into the gamut of scenarios you can run into during this course. You know, no HDR is an HDR, but you need to modify it, how to deal with spatial lighting, how to do just kind of blocking lighting passes to make sure all of your directions are correct. I'm definitely emphasizing that sort of technical aspect of this, creating a master light rig for a scene that you can then hand off to other shots. We will be definitely focused on industry standard approaches that I've been using throughout my years lighting in 3D. Are the scenes already created, or do we also build them? So when we're talking about sequence lighting, I will provide you some animation for, you know, this shot where we see the cruisers, because there's not really a lot of scene building. It is this ship and this smaller one here. So these, I will be handing out some animation files so we can focus solely on lighting. But for the later shots where we start to look at, you know, right here, we will definitely be building this entire scene from nothing. Just from assets, we're going to take a look at reference and how to analyze reference. So we will be doing scene building, and these very basic scenes kind of at the beginning will be provided because there's not really a lot that goes into them from a scene assembly standpoint. We can look at some quick and dirty animation techniques, how I made these in Solaris, but you know, it's not really a focus. We'll run through it quick just so you know how to make a ship kind of fly in a line and the camera follow it. There's nothing too fancy there. So yes, the answer is both. We will be both using pre-made small scenes, but we will be building the bigger scenes. More description about shading. Will it be with Material X or Principled shaders? We will be using a combination of Material X and the Arnold standard surface. We will create a template so that we can really be making both at the same time as we're loading assets in, because that really is the great part about using Solaris and USD. We can very easily switch from render engine to render engine, and as long as our material is set up for those respective engines, it is going to successfully load those in. So we'll look at how we can load both of them at the same time when we're working. We will not be working with Principled shader. I think it is kind of on its way out, and we will be using Material X, especially since that works with Karma XPU, which is really how I got some of the bigger scenes in this class, rendering quickly and efficiently. Do we learn how to create / texture the Earth? That's in the trailer. It's certainly not an emphasis. I may do a bonus video at the end of the course, but the Earth is just more of a piece of the overall scene that we are trying to make. We can walk through it in a bonus video at the end. I think that actually sounds like a really nice idea. But we're just going to kind of provide that base asset for the top-down shot that we see right here. Let me just show you here. This is a full CG planet. I believe I said that earlier. I'll show you kind of how to make this in a bonus video at the end. But like I said, that's not what we're trying to emphasize here. We're trying to emphasize scene, assembly, layout, lighting, and all of that good stuff. Another question about what skill level we should be at. Can someone who just started their Houdini fundamentals go through this? It's my first foray into 3D, so could I join this and follow along? I would say if you understand sort of the baseline idea behind, you know, how do you build this material? How do PBR shaders work? How do I plug the normal, the base color, the metalness, the roughness, what those do? If you feel comfortable with that knowledge, I think you have all that you need to hop into this course. If you don't have that, I would maybe try to, you know, get a little more well-rounded 3D knowledge. I feel like that feels like a good line at where to hit for the knowledge of this course. We'll be doing some very tiny, you know, effects things in this course, but it's nothing compared to the great gamut of classes that Rebelway has otherwise. We'll be doing a little bit of ocean. We have these trails, but they're just very simple simulations because it's not a focus of this course. I'm going to show you how to get effects in here and how to light it and render it, but this isn't an effects course. This is a lighting and scene assembly course. How heavy are the scenes that we'll be using in this course? What do you recommend for a minimum RAM, CPU to be able to handle this well? Or is USD light enough that it isn't too much of a concern compared to normal Houdini work? Can I do this with a 3060 Ti? How long did rendering take? Can I do this with a mediocre graphics card? So, you know, it's an interesting question. It's a good question. I would say that if you have a box where you're doing like mid-level sims and effects, you're probably safe taking this course. Boxes that can handle, you know, medium to medium high level of sim fidelity, I think you should be fine with rendering. I'd personally probably recommend at least 64 gigs of RAM. Maybe you could get away with 32, but this asset here is pretty large, so just keep that in mind. When I was working on this, I had a couple different, you know, rendering styles. I was rendering the ship shots with my CPU, which is a 3950X, and you know, it's a pretty good CPU. It ranks pretty highly, but there's certainly much better CPUs that are out there. And with this, I was able to render most of these outside space ship shots overnight, you know, and we're able to take advantage of certain things too, because this was just a still frame in the background. As we look at these other shots, these are just still frames. So you're probably safe with most setups. It'll just take a while. Rendering this big shot does require some beef in your graphics cards. This shot took my computer about 5 minutes a frame to render, and that's because I had a 3090 and a 4090 chewing on it. So that was very helpful. It'll likely be a bit slower for you. I certainly don't expect people to have that graphics card, or those graphics cards rather. I would say for VRAM, you should probably have at least 8 gigs because it starts slowing down pretty significantly once you're out of video memory. But at the same time, we're going to be looking at workflows that are used to test out our lighting before it's fully rendered. We'll look at first, middle, last frames. We'll look at rendering our frames in tens, you know, things that you do in the visual effects industry. So just don't think because you can't render a sequence overnight, you shouldn't take this course. You know, I'm not expecting that. I think that's an unrealistic expectation. We're going to learn how to kind of dummy-proof our render, so we only have to do the long sequence once, because unfortunately, as working as individual artists, we don't have access to a large render farm. If I were to render this in Arnold, it would probably take 2 to 3 hours a frame minimum. It might take even longer. So yeah, that's what I would kind of say in regards to that. Is this course based solely in Houdini Solaris, or will it also cover some Nuke? Yes, we will be covering some Nuke. We're not going to dive too deep into it. We're just going to learn kind of some secret spices that I have for making our renders look a little bit nicer, a little bit more realistic. If you've seen my compositing fundamentals videos, it's really going to be applying those principles, and we'll walk us through everything there. Having zero experience in Nuke, is it Houdini oriented, or can I purchase it to practice my compositing skills in Nuke? So if you are a Nuke artist and you just want some renders for this, I think you might struggle with this class a little bit. Nuke is certainly a part of this class, but it is a smaller part. So I'm not sure I would recommend it just to get some renders, because you will have to create the renders yourself. I'm giving you the assets, but I'm expecting you to put in the work doing the lighting. So yeah, that would kind of be my answer. If you're expecting to just get renders for Nuke, I would say no. If you want to learn how to create the renders so then you can comp your own stuff in Nuke, then I would say yes, because we're going to kind of work from the ground up. Just make sure you have that general 3D knowledge that I was talking about earlier. Will it cover AOVs in Karma, Arnold, and working in Aces and converting textures to Aces? Yes to both. We will be covering AOVs. I mentioned earlier we're going to make a tool for Arnold to automatically split our light groups, which is very handy. We are going to do a big dive into color space because I'm very big on it. It's very important with consistent color and consistent workflow. It's just vital to having the image look like what you expect it to look like. So we will be covering all of that. Will this course be covering how different passes work, how to set them up, and export them from Houdini into Nuke? Absolutely. We're going to cover AOVs. It's a vital part to the visual effects process. We're going to look at how to briefly use them in Nuke. We're not going to dive too much into that. This isn't a Nuke class, but we'll certainly look at setting those up in the most efficient way that we can and their basic uses. And our final question, how production ready do you think the Solaris Karma workflow is right now? Are you in other studios still working with regular Houdini Arnold or Solaris Arnold? Which kind of shots do you think you'll still be turning to Arnold for? This is a really good question, and I think there is some kind of nuance to the answer here. The part that is most production ready to me is Solaris. I think Solaris as of Houdini 20 is very, very stable. A lot of the render engines have very good integration into Solaris now. Most of their features have been ported over. They're still slightly buggy, but enough to where I think it's worth it. But making the shift into Solaris itself is a very big endeavor for a visual effects studio. And the bigger that they are, the bigger their pipeline is, and the more intertwined with their original apps. And so I think making that shift to start with is big enough where they only want to change, the minimal amount of variables at a time. So they're not going to go, well, let's abandon RenderMan and go full Solaris Karma. They're going to kind of dip their toes in and use it on smaller, more straightforward projects where they kind of know there's not a lot that can go wrong. You're not going to immediately dive into Karma and do a furry creature necessarily for a huge, big budget client when you haven't done it before on kind of a smaller scale. So there's lots of testing that needs to happen, I think, before Karma is adopted industry-wide. I do really like XPU. I'm always a big proponent of XPU. It allows you to iterate faster, and anything that lets you iterate faster, I absolutely love. So I think a shot like this in our trailer is pretty great for using Karma, but if you're working on a huge multi-million-dollar feature like Ant-Man, this was a shot that I did in Arnold, I would be a little bit nervous to do it in Solaris and Karma just because this really pushed my limits of what I knew of Arnold, let alone an entirely new software. And getting these shots to render was really a deal and a half. These took a very, very long time to render and to get to render, with physically based properties. And so we kind of only want to change one variable at a time as we are moving into new software. So I'd say right now, Solaris is very much production ready. And Karma, I think, is in its initial testing phases. That's kind of how I would wrap up that question. So yeah, that is what I have. Thank you for these wonderful, wonderful questions. If you have any more, certainly let me know and we'll find a way to get an answer to you. And thanks so much for listening, and I hope to see you in the course. Thanks.